On this episode of the Athletic Acuity Sports Podcast, I'm going to be going over a large fantasy football preview for the 2020 NFL season. I'm recording this on August 4th, just in case any players decide to opt out before this video is produced. And obviously there's a little bit of uncertainty about the 2020 NFL season. It's very clear that the bubble format has been executed really well by both the NBA and the NHL. And I, like a lot of other people, am a little bit concerned about what the NFL is going to look like with so many more players per roster. But despite that, I'm still going to go over a fantasy football preview here in this podcast. This is about the time where I usually start doing mock drafts and sort of getting my prospects in order for the fantasy season. So I tend to go into each fantasy draft every year with a pretty short list of players. I tend to pick 3 or 4 guys at the running back position who I target earlier, a few guys who I target in the middle rounds, along with a very small handful of receivers, along with a couple quarterbacks, a couple tight ends. Sometimes I go into drafts with a list of a dozen guys who I want, with maybe 8 backups, sort of like guys who I still like as prospects for the season, but guys who I'm sort of using as fallback options. Obviously, because of that, short list of players, I'm not afraid to draft guys a little bit higher than where they're projected to go. I don't think it's great to succumb too much to any individual projection. I think taking guys who you have a high opinion of is the right way to go about it. I tend to see these things pretty clearly, season to season. And so all my analysis today about fantasy football is going to pertain to a standard scoring league. What I mean by that is it's not PPR. Starting 1 quarterback, 2 receivers, 2 running backs, a flex, a tight end each week. And I'm really referring mostly to 10-team leagues, so just about as standard as you can get. Strategies are definitely a lot different if you have a different format of scoring. If it's not, 1 point for every 10 yards for both running backs and receivers. If you're doing PPR, it definitely changes things a lot. The discrepancy between running backs and receivers changes quite a bit. If it's like a 2 quarterback starting league, that totally changes things. Quarterbacks become a lot more valuable in leagues like that. So just know that my analysis today pertains to as standard as you can get. All right, so I'm going to go position by position, starting with running back, and just go over a short list of guys who I think are good values. I'll pick a few guys who are, projected to go earlier in the draft, a few guys who are projected to go in the middle area, a couple later picks that have some potential. And so running back, to me, is the most valuable position in fantasy football, which is almost the direct opposite of reality, because when you're really constructing an NFL roster, running back is one of the most replaceable. Interestingly, in fantasy, it's actually the least replaceable, which makes it the most valuable. Specifically in 10-team leagues where you're starting 2 running backs, you've got a flex, and where you have standard scoring, to me, the optimal strategy for years in fantasy football has been to draft running backs early and often in fantasy drafts. I have always taken a running back in the first round. There's been lots of drafts where I take a running back in each of the first 3 rounds. A lot of times I'll have 5 running backs on my depth chart in the first 7 or 8 rounds of the draft. I really do like to invest a lot in that position. And the reason why is because when you look at the discrepancy between an average scoring running back at the end of a fantasy season compared to the number 1 guy, there's a bigger discrepancy there between a mediocre scoring running back and an elite running back than there is with any other position. So with quarterback, you can maybe get 80% of the first quarterback in the NFL, around the middle of the pack with quarterbacks. With running backs, the guy who's ranked, I don't know, like 20th in the league is going to be awfully distant from that first guy. And again, with receivers, there's typically a smaller discrepancy. So all of these investments, all these darts that I throw at the running back position in fantasy drafts, basically it comes down to there aren't that many good ones each year. There's not that many running backs who get that many carries. So the more that I have, the less other people have to build their teams with. So last year for the 2019 season going in, my big three, the three guys who I had on almost every fantasy team, at least I had some combination of two of these three on each fantasy team, were Nick Chubb, Damien Williams, and Derrick Henry. Obviously, Chubb and Henry worked out phenomenally. The number 1 and 2 leading rushers in the NFL. Damien Williams was a little bit more disappointing. I picked him mostly because of his situation rather than his actual talent, but the McCoy thing was a little bit annoying, and Williams was nursing some injuries along the way. He didn't really erupt until the playoffs started, the actual playoffs, which meant nothing to fantasy, so that was a little bit disappointing. But overall, it was very successful last year. It just comes down to guys like Nick Chubb and Derrick Henry being undervalued by the public, and it's important to be able to identify those guys who aren't being valued enough. So my big three for running backs going into the 2020 season, if it happens, it starts with Clyde Edwards-Helaire in Kansas City. And so Clyde Edwards-Helaire is basically has everything working for him that Damien Williams had, except he's probably more talented, and Damien Williams has already publicly opted out of the 2020 season because of the situation. So Clyde Edwards-Helaire, if this season happens, is going to have probably a backfield to himself. You know, the Chiefs selected him in the first round, so they're going to be sort of incentivized to use him more. He can catch out of the backfield, and what I love about this Chiefs offense and why I love picking Andy Reid running backs is that even though they throw the ball a lot more than they run the ball, defenses have to be way more concerned about Tyreek Hill, Travis Kelce, even Sammy Watkins and Mecole Hardman before they're paying attention to Clyde Edwards-Helaire. So the offensive line doesn't have to be that good. The defense is already spread out, and you can get a lot of cheap yards with running backs underneath. And the other thing is that playing in that Chiefs offense gives you a much higher touchdown probability relative to other running backs. So, you know, sometimes there are bad teams who run the ball a lot, and your guy might be getting more carries, but is he actually scoring touchdowns? Because touchdowns are really key in fantasy. This is why I love Chiefs running backs. As long as Andy Reid and Patrick Mahomes are there, Clyde Edwards-Helaire, if this season happens, is going to have all kinds of opportunities. So right now, I'm going to go over the ESPN rankings. I checked NFL.com, and their list is a little bit messed up right now. It's not really updated. I checked it a couple days ago. Clyde Edwards-Helaire on ESPN.com is ranked 17th overall. He's the 10th running back listed. If he's ranked 17th overall, I think I would take him in the top 5 personally. I think if I had the 5th overall pick, I probably just wouldn't hesitate. I would just take him. If I had like a later first round pick, that would probably be, optimal for me just so I could get more value with another player. But I love his situation going into next year. The other thing about him that I would say is that if you take Clyde Edwards-Helaire, you should definitely draft a handcuff because that offense is so good. Like Clyde Edwards-Helaire's value is really derived from the offense he's playing in. So even though Damien Williams would be a great handcuff to have, you could just pick up like Darrell Williams later in the draft and use him as a handcuff. I think Darrell Williams would be a good guy to select, even if you can't get your hands on Clyde Edwards-Helaire later in the draft, just so that you have this really valuable piece in case any injury happens to the starter in Kansas City. So my number 2 value, and this is a player who I have a lot of faith in, Austin Ekeler. It was funny because I think that when Melvin Gordon sat out, I think all the people who really watched football kind of knew that, Ekeler's probably better than Melvin Gordon, even though he wasn't getting the starting role when they were both healthy. I'm always so impressed with Ekeler, his ability to break tackles. He's actually one of the most sturdy yet elusive running backs in the league. You'd think it was someone like Fournette or Ezekiel Elliott or someone like that. I'm telling you, Ekeler breaks more tackles on average than those guys by miles. So Ekeler's stepping into this season for the Chargers as the starter. He's ranked 29th overall on ESPN, 14th among running backs. So what I like about Ekeler, not only that he's really good, is that he's also one of the best players on the offense. So they're going to feature him a lot. Keenan Allen's pretty good. Mike Williams is okay. Hunter Henry tends to get injured, but he's good when he's in. This offense has enough around it where I feel like it's going to be, probably below average because Tyrod Taylor and Justin Herbert is not a great quarterback combination in my opinion, but I think Ekeler is going to get tons of touches. I think him being ranked 29th on ESPN, I would take him easily a full round higher than that. I see him more as a second round pick in a 10-team league, not a third rounder, let alone a late third rounder. And the other thing about Ekeler that's good is that he's got a really talented handcuff. Justin Jackson, a guy who not a lot of people know about, but pretty good running back prospect, and he's the backup for the Chargers. So if Ekeler ever gets hurt, I think you have a pretty reliable guy who you can stash as the last guy on your bench in Justin Jackson. All right, my third best value at running back going into this year is Kenyon Drake. This is another guy who I just think is a lot better of a running back than most people realize. I think, there's an argument, in my opinion, for Clyde Edwards-Helaire, Austin Ekeler, and Kenyon Drake to be 3 of the 10 or 12 best running backs in the NFL today. And that's saying a lot. And, call me crazy, but I said the same thing about Nick Chubb and Derrick Henry last year. Kenyon Drake, I think, is not only in a great situation, but he's super talented. Another running back who unexpectedly breaks tackles at a higher rate than almost any other running back in the league. He has been suffocated in a terrible situation in Miami. His yards per carry does not reflect how good he's been. He should be averaging more. I get kind of Jamal Charles-y vibes from him. He's a really talented and gifted running back. He's got great vision. He can catch out of the backfield a little bit. Just a really fluent and fast player. He's currently ranked 16th on ESPN, 9th among running backs. I would take him in the late first round. I feel pretty confident. So, my strategy going into this draft would be hopefully I get a later first round pick so that, if I'm sitting there at 8, 9, or 10, I can maybe get 2 of these top 3 guys that I'm really in love with going into this year. But yeah, Kenyon Drake, really good offensive situation he's going to be playing in. I'm not too concerned about the offensive line. I think Kyler is going to take another step forward. I think he's a promising quarterback. DeAndre Hopkins was a great addition. They've got some speedy receivers. And Drake is another guy who has a really good backup. Chase Edmonds is another backup who I think is undervalued, and you can use him as a handcuff. And look, during a 1 or 2 game stretch last year where David Johnson was injured and the Cardinals hadn't traded for Kenyon Drake yet, Edmonds looked really good and he actually put up a lot of points. So I think Edmonds is a good guy to stash on your bench if you draft Drake, and he might even be a good guy to stash if you don't draft Drake. All right, so now that I've gotten the top 3 guys out of the way, it's time that I go through some other guys who I think are good values, just kind of going down the list here. So Nick Chubb in Cleveland, he was one of the big 3 for me last year. He's actually my number 1 guy. Got him on a lot of teams. He's currently ranked 15th right now on ESPN, 8th among running backs. And I think the reason why is because Kareem Hunt is there, and you could really make the argument that Nick Chubb and Kareem Hunt are 2 of the 5 most talented running backs in the NFL right now. So look, I think if you take Nick Chubb, you probably have to take Kareem Hunt. And Kareem Hunt is going to be a premium backup. There's not too many guys who are backups on their own team at running back who are getting taken like 55th overall or whatever. But that's going to be Kareem Hunt this year because he's just so talented. The offense is good. I trust Baker. I think Stefanski is going to do a better job. The offensive line's improved. I think Odell is a lot better than what he showed last year. Jarvis Landry is pretty good. I think this offense is going to be a lot better this year. So Chubb ranked 15th. I would take him at the end of the first round if somehow 2 of my top 3 guys were gone. I think Chubb is a really good insurance policy to have. There's also a case for Chubb to be one of the best running backs in the league right now. So Josh Jacobs is ranked 21st on ESPN, 13th among running backs. This is more of like a last resort if something weird happens and some of your top guys are gone. I think Jacobs is good. I think he's going to be featured in the offense. The Raiders are going to use him a lot. So yeah, I think he's one of those guys who's in good enough of an offensive situation, and he's going to get enough carries to the point where he looks like a pretty viable piece to add. I think he's pretty talented. I think he's one of the 15 best running backs in the league, roughly. So Jacobs, pretty good in his rookie season. I think 21 overall, 13th among running backs. I could see him being a top 10 guy among running backs this year. All right, the next best value that I see is Le'Veon Bell. So Le'Veon Bell is ranked 52nd overall on ESPN. That's 21st among running backs. I think people took him way too high last year, considering that he was just off for an entire season before that and that he was joining the Jets. But I think people are undervaluing him this year. If this season happens, the Jets offense is going to be probably improved by a little bit. I think Darnold's going to be a little bit better. They threw a bunch of darts at the offensive line. I don't love any single guy they added. When you look at Mekhi Becton, George Fant, McGovern, like I don't love any individual piece they added, but they added a lot of pieces to the offensive line. So chances are the offensive line is going to be better. And the group of receivers the Jets have is a little bit improved. I like Denzel Mims as their second round pick. I think that Brashad Perryman, if he can be used the right way, I think could be an effective player. Overall, I think the Jets are probably a little bit undervalued in general. And I think Le'Veon Bell, he only had a 3.2 yards per carry last year. That was really a function of the offensive line being brutal. I think Bell is still relatively talented. I think he's 28 years old right now, so he's not at that magic age of 30 yet. He did get an entire year off 2 years ago, so he might be a little bit looser, might have a little bit left in the tank. I think at 52 overall, that would be a steal. I think I would take him 20 spots higher than that. All right, so David Johnson is ranked 36th overall. He's 18th among running backs. And so David Johnson's interesting. I hated the trade for Houston this offseason. I thought Arizona completely fleeced them out of a ridiculously good player in Hopkins. With that being said, David Johnson is still entering a pretty good situation for himself. Deshaun Watson's one of the 5 best quarterbacks in the league, probably. If you look at this Texans receiving group, they actually have some downfield weapons I like. Brandon Cooks, Will Fuller, and Kenny Stills. That's 3 guys who can stretch the field pretty well, even though, 2 of those 3 guys, Cooks and Fuller, have had some injury problems. They signed Cobb as a slot receiver. They've got Kiki QT, who I think has been good in short spurts as a slot guy. They do also have Duke Johnson, who I think is a super undervalued receiving back. I just think that between David and Duke Johnson, you're going to be getting some good receiving out of the backfield. And I think David Johnson, I had him on a team last year, and it was pretty crushing to see the way that he just deteriorated after his injury, and then Kenyon Drake took his job. I want to remind people that David Johnson, despite having a bad contract and being involved in a lopsided trade where he was part of the bad side, he actually played fine last year before he got injured. And the injuries are a little bit concerning, but you're not taking him in the first round. You're not taking him in the second round. He's being listed as like a late 4th round pick. So I think in that range of the draft, David Johnson's probably a good guy to take a chance on. And if you want to back him up by taking Duke Johnson later, I think it'd be a smart thing to do. I think the Texans are still going to have a pretty good offense as long as Watson's healthy. Okay, so Mark Ingram is the next guy I'm going to talk about. He's currently ranked 68th on ESPN.com. He's ranked as the 30th overall running back. So at first I was like, all right, Ingram, whatever. But then I was like, all right, he's ranked 68th. That's ridiculous. He's the starting running back on a team that runs the ball more than any other team in the league and has one of the better run blocking offensive lines. I understand that a lot of those carries go to other guys. People are probably worried about J.K. Dobbins as a second-round pick. Gus Edwards has been a pretty good backup. Lamar gets a lot of carries himself. But Ingram was actually really good last year. And to get him at 68 overall, if he's like your RB4, that's ridiculous. I mean, Ingram, I think the thing is that you shouldn't be concerned about Dobbins because the Ravens run the ball so frequently that Ingram's going to get his touches. And Ingram hasn't always been that good of a receiver out of the backfield, which is what I knock him for. But, you know, that's not really what his role is in Baltimore. And the Ravens offense has been efficient. He does have good touchdown chances relative to most running backs. So I think Ingram, if you can get him as like your RB3, RB4, I think you're in good shape. So I just thought that was a good value I'd point out. Okay, so another guy I wanted to point out is James White. James White is currently ranked 123rd overall on ESPN. He's ranked 43rd among running backs, which to me is way too low. So I don't love taking Patriots running backs, but it's kind of interesting. But each of the past like 2 or 3 years, I haven't been the one to draft James White, but I've had him on a couple teams because for some reason, fantasy owners I've played with have randomly been dropping James White mid-season after like a game where he's not really involved in the game plan. And I am always pretty quick to pick this guy up. And it's just weird. Like in each of the past 2 years, I've had either like a bye or an injury. I've put James White in as the substitute, and he has actually, you know, magically taken me out of some really difficult spots with some really big clutch performances. I think James White is a talented guy. I think he's a really good receiver out of the backfield. He can literally play slot receiver sometimes for them. I don't know why people drop him or undervalue him. He's a good running back. He's truly one of like the 15 or 20 best running backs in the league. Most of his value is derived as a receiver, but you know, just basic math, the average reception is a larger amount of yards than the average rushing attempt. So James White has tons of value. I understand that Brady won't be there this year, but I still think the Patriots are going to use that guy. And he's really one of the more, you know, efficient players on that offense. If you look at the Patriots offense, they're not loaded with receivers. James White might be used a lot in the short and intermediate game throwing the football. So I like James White a lot. I just think at 123 overall, you know, that's definitely a good risk to take. If James White is like the 6th best running back on your team for fantasy, I think you're in great shape. I mean, he's someone who really can sub in for you during a bye week, during an injury time. So I like James White a lot. All right, just a few more guys I'm going to mention at running back. I always like to find guys who are the starters on their respective teams later in the draft. And so even if I don't love the player, you know, completely, getting starters late is important. So one guy to keep in mind is Jordan Howard in Miami, along with Matt Breida. Jordan Howard is ranked 81st, which to me is a little rich. He's 35th among running backs. If he were to fall like 10 spots in the draft or so, I would feel more comfortable about taking him maybe in like the 10th round or so. Breida is ranked 129th overall, 45th among running backs. I think that's a little bit low. In my humble opinion, I think Breida is actually a better running back than Howard straight up. But I actually am predicting that Miami is going to use Howard more than Breida because I just get the vibe that Miami likes the bigger tank running backs. They were using Kalen Ballage, who was just a mess over Kenyon Drake for part of the season. So I just kind of get the impression that Miami might favor Howard more than Breida. And Howard is listed as the starter right now, so that is important. But both guys are new to the team, and I do think Breida has some talent. So I think both of those guys, if you wanted to pick them up later, make some sense for your bench. Another guy that kind of caught my eye, and at first I was kind of not into it because I don't really think this player is very good. But Sony Michel is the starter on the Patriots, and they're going to be a rushing offense next year, most likely. He's ranked 93rd, 41st among running backs. Michel has been a bit of a flop. I thought it was a really poor and bizarre pick when it happened in the 2018 draft. But he shouldn't be ranked 93rd. He's the starter on a team that's going to run the ball a little bit. If Cam Newton's the quarterback, whether it's Newton or Stidham, they're probably going to, try to run the ball a little bit. And in my opinion, if Newton's the starter, I think there's a chance we see kind of a Ravens-looking offense from the Patriots. So Sony Michel has been underwhelming. He offers almost nothing in the receiving game, which I think is surprising considering how he looked in college. But 93rd's a little bit low for me. So I think if you're kind of desperate later in the draft, I think Michel actually holds some value. Another guy who's ranked really low is Marlon Mack. He's ranked 122nd overall, 42nd among running backs. So the issue with Mack is that they drafted Taylor in the second round, and they also have Nyheim Hines to catch. My counterpoint would be Marlon Mack might still be the starter, and the Colts could have the best offensive line in the league, top to bottom. Like, they have no holes, and all 5 of those offensive linemen are pretty solid. So I think Marlon Mack could actually be a great value. 122nd overall is really low for him. I would take him like 20 spots higher than that, stash him on my bench. He could be my 5th best running back in fantasy. We'll see what happens with him. And if it doesn't work out and Taylor is just getting all the carries, then that's fine. But I think it's a good risk to take for Marlon Mack that late. And then the final guy I'll talk about is Ito Smith, ranked pretty low. Ito Smith is someone you're going to take in one of the last few rounds of your draft, most likely. He might even be a waiver wire guy after the draft is over. Here's the only thing I like about Ito Smith. He plays for a team where the starter is vulnerable due to injury, Gurley with his knee problems, and he plays for a team that has a good passing efficient offense, which will in turn help Ito Smith get a better touchdown probability if he becomes the starter. So very end of the draft type of guy. Ito Smith has been, mildly impressive, I think, in the brief amount of time that I've seen him. He's a better receiver out of the backfield than I thought initially, and I think he would be pretty successful, kind of could have like a Tevin Coleman type of impact for the Falcons at some point. Okay, so that was the, relatively small list of running backs who I like going into the 2020 season. It's not perfect. It's just, a group of guys that I'm going to kind of keep my eye on going into the year. With that being said, I think it's important to also talk about some guys who I don't like going into the 2020 season. So this is going to be a short list of running backs. I call it my do not draft list. Some of these guys have been on the list for a while now, and it really boils down to if I think that you're being overrated by the public in terms of how skillful you are as a player, or if it comes down to injuries. Because kind of an underrated aspect of fantasy football is to have availability for your players. Every year, there's always a couple fantasy owners moaning about how their team got totally injured. And look, sometimes injuries are random, but sometimes they're chronic, and you can kind of get ahead of it and realize, hey, like these guys are at higher risk. Let's not overdraft them. Let's not target these guys. And so I'm just going to go over some guys who have been on this do not draft list for the running back position for a long time. Let's start with Devonta Freeman, who's actually not on a team right now, so I wouldn't worry about him, but he was a guy for a long time where I was just like not taking him, and I would always kind of stash Tevin Coleman on my bench And Tevin Coleman would kind of have these like sneaky good touchdown performances where he would just generate a lot of value for like your sixth best running back on your team. So Freeman was always a big guy to stay away from. Another guy who I'm not a fan of is Leonard Fournette. I don't think Fournette's very good. He actually breaks a lot fewer tackles than people realize. To me, he's nowhere near one of the 10 best running backs in the league. He's nowhere near it. I wouldn't even put him in the top 20. I think he's really overrated. You know, the team has been bad with him. They've been bad without him. Like, the team isn't good. Fournette's ranked 34th overall, 16th among running backs. I just don't like him as a player very much. Doesn't offer enough as a receiver. And I just don't love his situation or his skill set. So a guy that has made his way onto this list is Todd Gurley. A couple years ago when Gurley broke out, I was all in on Gurley, took him, and it worked out beautifully. The last 2 years I've been avoiding Gurley, and last year I was trying to hype up Darrell Henderson to think that he was going to take over for Gurley. It didn't really work out because Henderson wasn't very good. He wasn't even the second string running back by the end of the season. It was Malcolm Brown. This year, I think Ito Smith is a lot better than either of the Rams backups last year. And I think that, you know, Gurley, there's not as much incentive for Atlanta to use him. He's under a cheap contract. The Rams had him under this, you know, huge contract last year. Gurley's ranked 35th overall, 17th among running backs, one spot behind Fournette. I just think that's a huge risk to take. If you do take Gurley, I think it's fine as long as you take Ito Smith as a backup. With Fournette, there's no like backup who you can trust. So at least with Gurley, he's in a good offensive situation. So if things do go well for him, you know, it'll be a function of like, hey, Matt Ryan, Julio Jones, Calvin Ridley, like this is a good situation he's entering. Another guy who's very new to this list, I just put him on the do not draft list after last year because I had him on two teams. James Conner, 37 overall is where he's ranked. He's ranked 19th among running backs. So he's pretty appropriately priced. I just like a lot of other guys better than him at this point to take chances on. James Conner has actually been injured a whole lot in his brief NFL career. And I feel kind of bad about this one because unlike Fournette and Gurley, who I think are a little bit overrated, I actually think Conner's a little underrated. He's actually very good. Offers receiving ability. He's been in, you know, some interesting situations in terms of the offenses. You know, he's very good offensive situation in 2018. Not so much last year because Roethlisberger was gone. But Conner has been good when the situation has been good around him. And I don't actually think that he's a bad player at all, but the injuries have really piled up. So I'm going to try to avoid Conner if I can for this upcoming season. Okay, another guy to avoid, in my opinion, is Dalvin Cook. I had him 2 years ago on a team, and I was so hyped after his rookie season where he got injured after 3 weeks, was leading the league in rushing. Then last year, or 2 years ago, I should say, he had the mysterious hamstring injury that left him out for several weeks. He would be practicing, he would be in pregame warmups, and then he just wouldn't play. And it was really annoying. Now, last year I avoided him, and it turns out that he actually played really well and rewarded the people who took a chance on him. But look, here's the thing. Last year he was like a second round pick, late second, early third round pick. This year he's ranked 6th overall, okay? That's way too high of a draft pick, I think, to spend on him. The only way it makes sense for Dalvin Cook is if you draft Alexander Mattison, who has also been pretty good, I think, in his brief amount of time. Last year, I thought he was pretty impressive, and I actually think he's someone who could compete with Cook at some point for carries a little bit more. But, you know, Dalvin Cook has had so many injuries, it just kind of feels like he's a higher risk guy to take a chance on. So as far as the injuries go, I wouldn't take a risk on him. I'd much rather go with some of my other guys like Edwards-Helaire, Kenyon Drake, Austin Eckler, where you're not as concerned about their injuries being chronic. And if they do get injured, it's more of a random thing And, all the upside is there with those other guys because they're in good offenses for the most part, at least with Clyde Edwards-Helaire and Kenyon Drake. But anyway, I think Dalvin Cook is just ranked a little bit too high for my taste. And the last guy I'm going to go over, and this is actually kind of a different reason altogether, but Melvin Gordon is ranked 38th overall, 20th among running backs. So the Broncos' backfield is just really crowded. They already had Phillip Lindsay and Royce Freeman, and now they bring in Melvin Gordon. You can call me crazy, but I actually think Lindsay is the best of those three running backs. I think Lindsay is a little better than Gordon, and I just think Gordon being ranked 20th among running backs is pretty high. I think he's a guy who I wouldn't really want to touch until 30, maybe even 40 picks later from where he's listed. So I'm not in on Melvin Gordon at all. I don't think he's bad, but I think he's definitely a little bit overrated. And, I think quietly Eckler was always better than him. And now I think Lindsay's probably better than him too. Okay, so now I'm going to move on to wide receiver. This is a position that I typically like to go cheaper on. As I mentioned earlier, there's a little bit more of a discrepancy between the top-ranked guys and the mediocre guys at running back than there is at receiver. So receivers are a little bit more replaceable in fantasy football specifically. And so I tend to feel like there are better values later. Okay, so at receiver, the one guy who I'm pretty hyped about right now is A.J. Brown. All right, he's ranked 39th overall, 15th among receivers on ESPN. To me, A.J. Brown is one of the 10 best receivers in the NFL today. And that's saying a lot because there are some super talented guys who I have A.J. Brown ranked over, but it's no accident what he was doing towards the end of last year. I think he was a big reason why Tannehill was uplifted towards the end of the season. The things he was doing on reverses, the deep speed, the size, he's really a special player. His physical style of play is similar to Julio. He really is a special player. And I just think that at 39 overall, if you get him around that spot, this could easily be someone we're talking about as a consensus top 20 overall pick in the following year. Another guy right in that area is Odell Beckham Jr. at 40 overall, 16th among receivers on ESPN. I just think Odell had a really off season last year. He just wasn't in any kind of groove. I think the biggest issues with the Browns offense from last year were resolved in the offseason. Freddie Kitchens was replaced by Kevin Stefanski, and they drafted Jedrick Wills Jr., and they also signed Jack Conklin. Their tackle play was bad last year, but they signed and drafted a tackle on each side. I think this offense is going to be a lot better. I still have faith in Baker Mayfield being a pretty good prospect, even though there were some concerns last year. I think Odell at 40 overall is a really good deal. I think you could make the argument he could go 10, 15 spots higher than that. So if you get him in that 4th round area, that's really the spot where I would want either A.J. Brown or Odell Beckham after taking running backs a little bit earlier. A third guy to mention who's ranked also in that, 4th round area is Courtland Sutton, who's 33rd overall on ESPN, 14th among receivers. So Courtland Sutton's another guy who I think is probably one of the 10 or 12 best receivers in the league. And look, there are some other guys out there who I'm a little bit lower on than most people, but I love Courtland Sutton. He very quietly was amazing last year, and the quarterback situation wasn't good at all, and yet he produced. I think Sutton is probably the most underrated receiver in the NFL. And, that's what this video is really all about. It's all about identifying the prospects that people don't realize are as good as they really are. To me, A.J. Brown, Odell, Courtland Sutton, these are guys who are super talented in reasonable offensive situations who I just think are talented enough to carry maybe mediocre quarterbacks, maybe slightly above average quarterbacks in the case of Mayfield, to pretty good heights. Okay, so moving down the list a little bit here, after those three guys, I think the rest of this group is going to be a little bit more compact in terms of how much I like one guy over another. But Deebo Samuel's someone who I like quite a bit, and he's ranked 72nd overall, 33rd among receivers. So Deebo is going to be missing the first few weeks of the regular season next year. And it's a little bit tricky with injuries, but one strategy that I've implemented a lot in drafting for fantasy is that you want to target guys who are undervalued for any reason possible. And if that means that they're undervalued because they're suspended for a few games, I remember Le'Veon Bell back in, I think it was 2016, I got way later just because he was suspended for the first couple weeks. I remember a couple years ago, Edelman was suspended 4 games and I got him really late and it turned out to be a great addition. Sometimes guys who are suspended are overly dragged down from where they should be ranked on some of these sites. And Deebo has an injury situation, which is different from a suspension where, a suspension, a guy's coming back when the suspension is over. With injuries, it can be a little bit difficult. I drafted AJ Green in a couple teams last year, and that turned out to be bad, although I did get to trade him for assets before people figured out that he was just sitting out the whole year. But in the case of Deebo, I think he probably misses 2 or 3 games to start the year. And, dangerously, it sounds like we're saying that about AJ Green last year. But if you're taking him at, 70 overall, the 7th, 8th round of the draft, it's not that big of a risk. If Deebo Samuel's like your 3rd receiver, I think it's fine. I mean, he was so impressive last year, and Kyle Shanahan has used him really well. Emmanuel Sanders won't be there. They still do have Kittle to take, probably the majority of double coverage. I still like Garoppolo a lot. I think that offensive situation is good. And I think Deebo Samuel is the most talented wide receiver on that depth chart. So I think Samuel, despite maybe being gone a few weeks, will end up being worth it if you take him later. Speaking of AJ Green, he's ranked 58th on ESPN, 29th among receivers. I don't know. AJ Green, I know he missed the whole last season, but 29th among receivers would be pretty surprising in a negative way if that happened. I think AJ Green could very easily finish as one of the 15 best receivers in terms of fantasy scoring output in this upcoming season. Joe Burrow is going to be a big step up from Andy Dalton, I think, and I think this offense is going to be a lot better. So I like the prospect of AJ Green as like a receiver 2 or a wide receiver 3. Julian Edelman is ranked 85th overall on ESPN, 36th among receivers. So I know Edelman's getting older a little bit, but this is a guy who is pretty head and shoulders clearly the best receiver on the Patriots, and I think he's going to be used a lot. I think that we might even get to see him throw a couple more passes than usual this year. But look, most of his value is derived from short and intermediate routes. I think he's going to be fine. He's good at creating separation. He's a good player. And at 85 overall, if he slips down to like 90 or so, I think it's just a good idea to take a guy like that later. I think some of these Patriots players are being a little bit too devalued based on the loss of Brady. Not to say this offense looks like it's going to be super efficient next year, but to get starters that late in the fantasy draft, I think if you stash those guys on your bench, it'll be fine. All right, another guy to mention is Terry McLaurin. I don't love this value, but he's one of those guys who I'm going to keep in my back pocket in case guys like A.J. Brown, Odell, and Courtland Sutton get taken earlier. So Terry McLaurin's ranked 47th overall, 22nd among receivers. I think McLaurin is one of the 15 best receivers in the NFL. I was blown away by how good he was in his rookie season last year, despite having below average quarterback play the whole time. He has established himself as a really good deep threat. He's a very talented route runner. He just has a good spacing on the field, good instincts for how to run routes and turn defenders around. I think he's a more versatile version of Brandon Cooks. I think this is a really talented guy. And the biggest knock for McLaurin going into this year is that if Haskins is the quarterback, you're wondering if, it's going to be that good of an offense. I think McLaurin was successful enough last year with Haskins to the point where I'm willing to forgive Haskins for being below average in order to draft this really talented deep threat in Terry McLaurin. Okay, so I have 4 final receivers to talk about, and these are the group that I have labeled as the late round steal group, where I think you might get a lot of upside from 1 or 2 of these guys if you take them late in your fantasy draft. I'm going to start with Brandon Aiyuk. Brandon Ayuk's ranked 148th overall on ESPN, 66th among receivers. So Brandon Aiyuk was not my favorite receiver going into the 2020 NFL draft, but the 49ers love him. He's entering a situation where you've got this great offensive system. Shanahan is one of the best at scheming people open. Aiyuk is a speedy, downfield type of guy. Emmanuel Sanders isn't there anymore. They still do have Kittle, and Deebo Samuel will be the number 1 guy when he gets healthy. I like Garoppolo. I like the whole offensive situation. So I think Aiyuk is in the best position out of any rookie receiver going into this 2020 season. There were other guys who I thought were maybe more talented going into the 2020 draft, but Aiyuk is in the best situation, and sometimes situation is really what's key in fantasy football. Speaking of good situations, my next deep sleeper guy is Mecole Hardman from the Kansas City Chiefs. So he's ranked 114th, a little bit higher than Aiyuk, 49th among receivers. I just think this is a smart risk to take. If this is like the 4th or 5th receiver on your depth chart in fantasy at the end of the draft, I think you're in pretty good shape. Hardman impressed me a lot during the 2019 preseason, and I picked him up on a couple teams a little bit before the curve, during the drafts. He ended up having a few brilliant performances last year, but was largely too inconsistent to be a starter. He wasn't really a playable guy. With that being said, though, Kansas City took him in the 2nd round. Sometimes it takes receivers a year or 2 to get acclimated into an offensive system. I think Hardman is super talented, and with all the interesting weaponry the Chiefs have, and with Mahomes and Reed, Hardman's going to have a chance to get a lot more touchdowns than the average receiver. And his deep threat ability is really appealing because a deep touchdown pass for a receiver is exactly what you want. Possession receivers are a lot less valuable than deep threats. If I'm choosing between, for example, Tyler Lockett or Robert Woods, you could make an argument that Woods is a better overall, more well-rounded receiver than Lockett. But what Lockett does well is more valuable, and that's what I'm looking for. So Mecole Hardman's got that late round value. If he breaks out, he's going to be a stud. I think he could eat into Sammy Watkins' touches a little bit, certainly DeMarcus Robinson's touches. So I think he's a good risk to take. All right, my second to last late round receiver is James Washington. This was a guy who I also took on a few different teams last year as a late round guy, and I'm sticking with him. James Washington had a really bad first season in Pittsburgh. He was drafted in 2018 in the 2nd round, had a really low completion rate when thrown at, did not do well in 2018. However, in the 2019 preseason, after watching all the preseason games, James Washington was actually maybe one of the best players in the league after that preseason. I want to say he was maybe the MVP, one of the MVPs of the 2019 preseason. And I know he was going against 2nd stringers and 3rd stringers, but it was impressive. I thought he looked really good, and I liked him before he was drafted too. Then the 2019 season rolls around, Roethlisberger's gone. They had terrible quarterback play in Pittsburgh. Rudolph was bad, and Duck Hodges was not much better. Despite that, Washington was a pretty successful deep threat. had over 700 yards, averaged almost 17 yards a catch with that bad of an offense. If Roethlisberger comes back and is even average or even a little below average, it'll be a huge step up from what Washington was working with the previous year. The only issue I have with James Washington is that the Steelers have a lot of good receivers. Juju Smith-Schuster is good. Deontay Johnson is a guy who I actually like as well. And they just drafted Chase Claypool in the second round, who I like. And Eric Ebron was just signed. So it's a little bit crowded in the receiver room with Pittsburgh, but if there's one guy I want to take a chance on late, it's James Washington, because even though Deontay Johnson was targeted more last season in Pittsburgh and he actually caught more passes than Washington still had more yards because of his downfield ability. So I'm going to trust that and think that if someone's going to break out, it can be James Washington. Okay, and very much finally, Michael Pittman Jr. for the Colts, ranked 127th overall, 59th among receivers. Again, Pittman Jr. was not even in my top 5 for favorite receivers going into the 2020 draft. But with that being said, I think he got taken by a team that's going to use him really well. He's going to be the co-starter with T.Y. Hilton. I say that because even though T.Y. has been good over the years, he's been injured a lot. And T.Y. might miss some time just due to injury again this year. There was talk about T.Y. Hilton considering retirement going into this season. So with that in mind, Michael Pittman Jr. might actually be utilized a lot. And it really does seem like Phillip Rivers would want a receiver like that to throw, back shoulder fades to, kind of a good jump ball receiver. I think Frank Reich's a pretty good play caller. They'll figure out a way to use him pretty well, I think, in Indianapolis. So next up, I'm going to go over the small handful of tight ends who I like going into the 2020 season for fantasy. Typically with tight end, I wait until later for that position. A few years ago, I took Zach Ertz late. He turned out to be a great player. I know that the year Kittle broke out, he was a really late round pick, maybe even a waiver wire for most people. And Mark Andrews was the guy this year who really helped out a lot of people in fantasy leagues. And so it just seems like every year there's a couple guys who can break out who are, from later in the draft. I've just never been a fan of spending like my second round pick or third round pick on a tight end. I understand that the tight end market is very stratified. You've got your top guys and then a lot of, empty space before you get to the next group. But to me, it sort of feels like every year there's a couple guys late who kind of pull through for you and kind of jump into the top 5 because it's so wide open after those first few guys. So at tight end, to me, the best value going into this year is Jared Cook from the Saints. He's ranked 105th overall on ESPN. He's ranked 10th among tight ends. If I'm just listing out the best tight ends in the NFL, just based on pure ability and what they've done so far, I think Jared Cook, you could make the argument, is one of the 5 best tight ends in the league. Very talented and also in a very good situation. I liked Jared Cook a lot going into last year too. I drafted him on several teams. I ended up dropping him because he had a really slow start after the first 3 weeks of the season. And I ended up dropping him. It turns out that Cook performed much better later in the year and kind of had all of his greatest performances kind of clumped together at the end of the season. So anyway, Jared Cook, a little frustrating last year, but he's very talented. And to me, for him to be ranked beyond 100 overall, I would take him 10 spots higher than that. I mean, if you're looking for a starting tight end in the 8th or 9th round and you can get a guy like Jared Cook, I think that's a huge win. That to me is a good value that late in the draft. Another guy to keep an eye on is Tyler Higbee. He's ranked 88th overall, 7th among tight ends. And so Tyler Higbee actually broke out at the end of last season pretty quietly. he was really good. He is a true receiving weapon, and he was good about making yards happen after the catch. He was breaking tackles. He looked like a pretty good route runner. I think Higbee is going to be a much bigger part of this offense going into this year. And I think it's part of the reason why the Rams were kind of comfortable with, allowing Brandon Cooks to be traded away. I think Higbee is in position to be one of the 10 best tight ends in the NFL right now. And definitely for fantasy purposes as well, because you've got Woods as your possession guy. Cooper Kupp is an interesting slot receiver that can do some things. Higbee could be that other element of the offense that makes this Rams team a little bit better. I don't think the Rams are going to be great next year, but I think Higbee could have a good statistical fantasy season at least. And the only knock with Higbee is that Gerald Everett is the backup, and Everett actually played pretty well also in place of Higbee at times during last season. All right, my third best value at tight end is Austin Hooper from Cleveland. So he was given a big contract this offseason. I was cool with it. I know that a lot of people thought he got overpaid. I think Hooper is one of the 8 best tight ends in the league. So I thought it was a good addition to what's already a pretty talented offense. I've already mentioned in this podcast, I think the Browns are going to be a lot better offensively for a lot of different reasons. And Hooper's ranked 135th overall on ESPN, 14th among tight ends. That is just really, really low in my opinion. I think he's one of the 8 or 9 best fantasy options at tight end. And if you can get him later, I think he's a guy who actually has a lot of upside. He was flirting with being the top scoring tight end before he got hurt last season. So he is used to playing in a good situation coming from Atlanta, and I think he'll continue being pretty good. I wouldn't worry about David Njoku being, kind of a high quality backup in Cleveland. I think Austin Hooper is going to get his touches. Another guy I'll mention if you're in, maybe a larger league or something is Jonnu Smith in Tennessee. He's ranked 193rd overall on ESPN, 20th among tight ends. I just think he's a little better than that. I think he's a uniquely gifted tight end. He's very athletic, very fast. They were using him on handoffs a little bit towards the end of last season. He's been a really good replacement for Delanie Walker, and I think Jonnu Smith is someone who has a little bit of breakout potential. Obviously, you're spending a really late round pick on him, so he's not someone you're banking on necessarily, but I think it's a good risk to take that late in the draft. And then 2 other guys I'm just going to throw out there just in case you're in some kind of massive 20-team league or something. Will Dissly for the Seahawks has actually played really well in really brief amounts of time. He's gotten hurt a lot in a short amount of time, which is the biggest knock. But if he stays healthy, he's playing with the second best quarterback in the league, and he's playing in an offense where teams are going to be a lot more concerned about Tyler Lockett and DK Metcalf before they're, targeting Will Dissly. So I think that could be a pretty good option late. And then one other guy to just kind of keep a real deep sleeper eye on is Devin Asiasi from New England, a 3rd-round pick from this past draft. He's someone that I think has long shot potential to be a good receiving tight end. I trust Belichick's eye for evaluating this kind of stuff, and he's a real long shot. So that one's probably not going to amount to anything, but if you're in some crazy 20-team league, Devin Asiasi might be a good tight end 2 to store on your bench. All right, and finally, we have the position of quarterback. Quarterback, very interestingly, is by far the most important position in actual football. So if you're assembling a team as a general manager, quarterback has got to be the first thing you look at with a team. However, in fantasy football, quarterback, at least in standard scoring leagues, is the least important of all the main positions. I'm kind of discounting defenses and kickers. So I remember back 7 years ago, I don't know, maybe give or take a year there, it was kind of mainstream and normal for people to draft quarterbacks in the first round of fantasy drafts. And I just remember that even back then, I always thought to myself, well, why why would I ever take Aaron Rodgers or Drew Brees or Tom Brady or Peyton Manning in the first round when I can get someone like Matt Ryan or Phillip Rivers like 8 rounds later, and those guys are like putting up 80% of the stats that the top guys are putting up? And it's a really good question. Now you fast forward to this season, and if you look at, 2019, 2018, it's funny because in 2018, Patrick Mahomes puts up the most incredible statistical season ever, and the following season, he's like ranked as a 3rd round pick. Lamar Jackson just put up the best rushing season ever for a quarterback last year, and going into this year, he's like an early 4th round pick. It's just interesting that people have kind of caught on to the idea that like you can get a bargain at quarterback. It's not something you want to take a chance on early. It makes no sense. Anyone who drafts a quarterback, like really any time before like the 7th round is just making a huge mistake for the most part, And, not only do I think that you should wait till a lot later to draft a quarterback because the alternative options are good, but also keep in mind that like when Patrick Mahomes broke out in 2018, he was a really late round pick because he hadn't started yet. Last year, going into the fantasy drafts, Lamar Jackson, I actually picked up on waivers on a few different teams, which is shocking to me now that teams, fantasy owners weren't taking chances on him, myself included, considering his rushing ability and how rushing yards are so important for quarterbacks. So basically the rule of thumb here is to never draft a quarterback before round 10, maybe even more than that. Streaming quarterbacks is a perfectly legitimate solution. I streamed quarterbacks on a couple different teams last year. It's a little bit tricky. You can get caught with the wrong guy at the wrong time sometimes, but usually it works out. Like usually you can go through and say, hey, who's playing Miami? Oh, Josh Allen is? Well, let's throw Josh Allen in there and let him run for a bunch of yards. So unless you're in some kind of 2 quarterback league, quarterbacks are really not that valuable in fantasy football. Obviously, I've mentioned Lamar, I've mentioned Mahomes. Last year, I had Jameis Winston and Russell Wilson on almost every team after my fantasy drafts were over. And those were guys who I took in like rounds 11, 12, 13 in a standard 10-team league. So you can get tons of value later in drafts, and it's all about picking guys who are in good situations. So going into this year, I'm obviously advising against taking either Lamar or Mahomes. Lamar is ranked at 31 overall. Mahomes is ranked 32nd overall. I just think that in the long run for your fantasy team, you're a lot better off taking a shot at a running back prospect or a receiver prospect who could help your team more, because those are the positions in fantasy that are a little bit more difficult to replace. And the other thing to keep in mind is that, you only have to start 1 quarterback each week. So there's a lot of good ones on the waiver wire each week. Not a lot of teams carry more than 2 quarterbacks. I usually only carry 1. Conversely, with running back and receiver, you're starting 2 running backs and 2 receivers each, plus a flex. So you have a lot more ground to cover with those guys, and there's fewer good ones. So if that makes sense, like it's harder to find good ones. Usually in fantasy drafts, I actually fill out part of my bench with running backs and receivers before I even draft a quarterback. So I have like my starters all set in for running back and receiver. I draft a bench full of running backs and receivers. I take a tight end, and then quarterback is a lot of times the last thing I do before taking a defense and a kicker. So going into this year, just going over a few quarterbacks who I like, a couple quarterbacks who I think have good situations and are undervalued. Matt Ryan is ranked 109th overall on ESPN. He's ranked 8th among quarterbacks. I think Matt Ryan is once again a little bit undervalued. I think there's a good chance that you get a top 5-ish type of season from him. He's a guy who's been in the conversation for leading the league in yards a lot. I don't even know if the Falcons are going to be that successful of a team, but Matt Ryan's going to be probably the leader of a very efficient passing offense once again. So I like Matt Ryan as usual. Another guy I like is Baker Mayfield. He's ranked 164th overall, 19th among quarterbacks. That's really low. 19th among quarterbacks. I'd be shocked if he finished 19th or worse, given that he plays, at least 15 or 16 games next season. I think Mayfield's a lot closer to being a top 12, maybe even top 10 type fantasy performer. I think people definitely were overdrafting him in fantasy before last season started. I liked Mayfield going into last year about as much as anybody, but I still didn't like the value of him in fantasy. I didn't really take Mayfield on a team until late in the year when I was, streaming and dropping guys when Mayfield was already on the waiver wire. But going into this year, I think you could legitimately go into the season with Mayfield as your starter and feel fine about it, because he does take a lot of good chances downfield. He does have a good deep ball. He is relatively accurate. I think that he's in a good offensive situation. And I think a lot of the Browns' problems last year were more tied to the coaching than to Baker. And I think Baker is just worth the risk at this point. So directly behind Baker at 165th overall, 20th among quarterbacks, is Jimmy Garoppolo. So Garoppolo was another guy on one of my many teams that I had where I would stream him. I streamed him for his Arizona games, which was beneficial to me. Most of that was, a function of Arizona not having a good defense. But here's the thing. Garoppolo doesn't really offer any rushing value, but he's a pretty good quarterback, and he's in a good situation. And the Niners do run the ball a lot, sometimes too much for Garoppolo to be a viable starter in fantasy. But I have a suspicion that the Niners are going to be more pass-oriented in the 2020 season, if it happens, than they were in the 2019 season. And the reason why is because I think the Niners are going to be a little bit worse defensively, just basically because of regression. I think there's a good chance that in some of these divisional games against Seattle and Arizona, the Niners might have some higher scoring games this year. And I think that Garoppolo has actually shown a lot that he's able to hang in there during high scoring games against tough opponents. I agree that Shanahan's an excellent coach, but you look at Shanahan's record with and without Garoppolo, it's not a fluke. Jimmy Garoppolo is a pretty good quarterback, and I don't hate him as a prospect going into the 2020 season. I think he's someone you take really late, you take a flyer on him, and you see how it works out for the first few weeks. One final guy I'm going to mention is Drew Brees. He's ranked 112th overall, which is 11th among quarterbacks. I think if Brees, if you take him around where he's listed, it's probably a pretty good idea. The good news about Drew Brees is that worst case scenario, Drew Brees is just awful. The age got to him. He's no longer viable. Sean Payton's not going to fool around and let Brees stay in there if he's not playing well, which means you're going to get Jameis Winston in a pretty darn good offensive situation if Brees isn't there. And so, to me, it's a win-win with the Saints quarterback situation. You're either getting Brees or Winston or Taysom Hill, who's got tremendous rushing ability. And the offensive situation is great. The offensive line is one of the best in the NFL. They've got Michael Thomas. They signed Emmanuel Sanders. They have Jared Cook. They have Alvin Kamara. And Sean Payton's been a good play caller, and he hasn't been afraid to go for it on fourth downs, giving his team extra possessions. So I like Drew Brees going into this upcoming season, and Drew Brees is a great example of why you don't want to mortgage a really valuable draft pick early for a quarterback, because why take Mahomes at 30 when you can get Brees at 115 overall? And Brees is putting up maybe 85% of the stats that Mahomes is putting up. To me, it just doesn't make any sense. So, I understand that the average fan is going to look at the numbers and say, well, this quarterback is averaging 22 points a game. That's more than any running back is averaging, and I get it. But it's about discrepancies between the average and the elite. Running backs, in short, have a really stratified economy. The quarterback economy is a lot less stratified. It's very compact. Almost all the quarterbacks are right around the same area for the first, 10 to 15, maybe even 17 guys. And of course, every now and then you'll find a unicorn season like Lamar or Mahomes. But it's important to realize that those seasons aren't super replicable. So just because Mahomes had one 2 years ago, it didn't mean that he was going to have another one. And he didn't in the 2019 regular season. As much as I love Mahomes and I think he's the best player in the league, his season last year was probably disappointing for fantasy owners because things like injuries can happen, and sometimes his, raw statistics aren't always matching up with how brilliant he is on the field. Similarly with Lamar, as much as he was amazing last year, I would not expect him to put up that many rushing yards again this year. All right, and final thing on our way out here, defenses and kickers are always the two last things you want to take unless you have some very strange scoring rules. I tend to go defenses in the 14th round, kickers in the 15th round of a standard 10-team standard scoring league. Don't be the guy who takes some stupid defense like 70th overall, because the reality is that when you look at defenses and kickers, almost every year, and this is crazy to some people, but almost every year, the top scoring defenses and kickers are on the waiver wire early in the season. And it's interesting, but every year it's a new team. It's hard to predict. No one thought it was going to be the Niners last year, but early into the season, a lot of people picked them up because it was like, yeah, this is a team that's just putting up a bunch of points on defense every week. Let's pick them up. And, in 2017, it was like the Jaguars randomly who were really good on defense. Kickers, it's like the same thing. You can find kickers all over the place. Robbie Gould was a popular pickup for me last year. And now he's ranked as like a top 5 kicker going into this fantasy season. But does that really matter at all? So anyway, kickers and defenses are generally trivial in fantasy, at least in the drafting process. You can't have a total disaster of a kicker-defense combination once the season starts, but my point is just that it's easy to find those kickers and defenses once the season has started, because you can just identify hey, the Niners are putting up 13 points a game in standard scoring on defense every week. Let's pick up the Niners and see what happens. So anyway, that was this episode of the Athletic Acuity Sports Podcast, Fantasy Football Special Edition. Thanks for listening.